Welcome to Speech Scope, a MedBridge podcast where we conquer challenging topics for the medical SLP. Our aim is to deliver actionable takeaways for clinicians like you through captivating discussions with experts in our field. To receive continuing education credit for this episode and access bonus resources, make sure to check out medbridge.com. Hello, I'm your host, Sarah Baar, a clinical SLP in Michigan with over 15 years of experience. I specialize in adult neurogenic disorders and the life participation approach. Today, I'm excited to be joined by Sarah Wallace, an expert in the area of aphasia treatment. We'll be diving deeper into this topic, including recent research and actionable takeaways you can implement right away. Welcome, Sarah. So glad to have you here. Can you get us started by sharing a little bit more about yourself?
Sure. Thank you so much, Sarah. I'm really thrilled to be here. A bit about me. I'm a professor and the program director of the Master's in SLP program at the University of Pittsburgh in the Communication Science and Disorders Department. Here, I teach classes, advise students, conduct research, and support clinical services for people with aphasia who live in our community. I'm excited also to announce that our aphasia community group, which started about 2 years ago, is just now beginning to offer weekly full-day services. And so that's something we're pretty excited about here right now.
Oh, congratulations. That's wonderful. I always like to hear about people's journeys, especially being someone who also loves to work with aphasia. Tell us a little bit more about what initially attracted you to spending your career in aphasia research and maybe how your passion has evolved over time.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. This is particularly fun to talk about with you as we have some of the same mentors from the early part of our careers who inspired us to do this kind of work with people with aphasia. So although I'd had some prior experiences with people with aphasia, probably the most formative experience I had early on was during my time at Western Michigan University, where I first learned about the life participation approach to aphasia from Sandy Glista and Robin Pollins. I learned from them about focusing my clinical work on helping people with aphasia return to activities that are important to them. So that included things like returning to reading and volunteering in the community. From those foundational experiences, I then had the opportunity to learn about and focus my research on augmentative and alternative communication through mentorship from Karen Hux and Dave Buchanan at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. A lot of what I learned from them was to use a very broad definition of AAC, which allows it to become more accessible and also allows it to support people in a lot of different ways. Also, from Sandy Glista, I learned about the importance of interprofessional collaboration, which I was lucky to continue to explore in my clinical work at Quality Living Inc. in Omaha, Nebraska, where I worked as a clinician primarily with people with traumatic brain injury and people who had strokes. And then during my first faculty position at Duquesne University, I had an opportunity to expand some of those interprofessional experiences. Occupational therapists are some of my favorite colleagues and my best friends. And it turns out that aphasia-friendly modifications that we're going to talk a bit about today fits very well into the work that occupational therapists do. So I was lucky enough to take on a series of projects with my OT colleague, Elena Donoso Brown.
Wow, that's wonderful. And yes, I'm just going to give a second shout out to the Western Michigan University people who have influenced us along the way. Go Broncos. And I feel so fortunate also to be mentored by those same people. I am really excited about just sharing some clear information about our topic today. So we're going to be talking about home programs, and we're also using the term aphasia-friendly. Knowing that we are going to have new clinicians and seasoned clinicians listening to our conversation, I thought we might start by just having a conversation about the concept or the definition of like what we're talking about when we say aphasia-friendly. So can you tell us, what do you mean by this and why is this an important concept to understand?
Yeah, thanks so much for that question. And to be clear, I'm not the first person to talk about aphasia-friendly. And I'm just really excited to be able to stand on the shoulders of others who've done some of this really important work. So typically in the research literature, aphasia-friendly refers to modifications that are often made to written materials to make them more accessible for people with aphasia. So this is like an environmental modification that makes it more accessible or makes written documents more accessible. Sometimes people also use this term to refer to people in the environment that have received instruction on how best to support people with aphasia in communication situations. So that's more kind of like communication partner training. The work that I'm going to talk about with you today focuses on the first thing, which is these modifications to written materials. And usually when we talk about modifications to written materials, the kinds of changes that we're talking about are simplifying the sentence structure, shortening some sentences, adding different types of images, increasing the white space that's available within the written document, and using some type of large standard font. Tanya Rose in Australia has done a lot of work in this area, as well as a number of colleagues in Canada. And although it hasn't been very well studied, it's my inclination, and I think many others, that the modifications that we often talk about for individuals with aphasia likely could be really helpful for other populations, including individuals with different types of dementia, or people who are trying to access written materials in non-native languages or in a language that's not their native language. So I think about this topic and it being really important for clinicians or speech language pathologists for at least two
Mm.
main reasons. First, I kind of think about the importance of when we work with people with aphasia, how important it is to identify modifications that may be the most helpful for them. So, what kinds of modifications out of some of those that I just listed might be the most helpful for them as an individual? And we also think a little bit about how, like, we use different measures of comprehension to make those determinations. And once some of those have been identified, clinicians then can work with communication partners to help make these adjustments in the environment if and when that's possible. And the second thing that we think a lot about are how people with aphasia would benefit from people in their environment. So, for example, other healthcare professionals could make some of these modifications, and that would benefit individuals with aphasia. So, for this, I think about professionals like medical professionals, physicians, occupational therapists, physical therapists, nurses, and how could we as clinicians work to help those professionals make some potentially generic types of modifications that we know might be helpful for individuals. How can we be part of a team that helps make those modifications? And what's great about that is it's a really good opportunity to get to collaborate, which is a big part of what I like to do.
Yes. Fantastic. I'm excited to get into those details a little bit more. And you have done research on this topic. So you have looked at the home program part of the clinical process, and how home programs are designed in an aphasia-friendly way. And you've published 2 papers on this topic. I would love to hear your takeaways about the research that you've done. Do you mind sharing some of the highlights of what you looked at and what you found out?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's important to start by saying, as I've kind of mentioned already, I was really fortunate to have an OT colleague who was already really interested in working with a speech language pathologist. And as part of our work together, we found some common ground in examining the use of home programs for people post stroke. So, and we both are also driven by this passion, this motivation to be sure that people with all types and severities of aphasia are included in important rehabilitation research that unfortunately people with communication disorders are often left out of. Another thing that was a great part of what we enjoyed about working together was that we were able to include students in our research, which allowed students from various disciplines to start to work together. I think you can kind of start to see, Sarah, I have this like drive to be like Sandy and Robin from the early days and just pass those lessons right back on to students and try to share some of that passion and motivation too.
I love that. Just like from the get-go, they're seeing like how we partner, how we collaborate, and how we kind of each bring our lenses to the same client and share different expertise. I love that.
Yeah, it's fun to get to kind of continue some of those things I learned early on. So one of our studies examined specifically the inclusion of music. So we worked with a music therapist within a home program that was designed to support people who needed to do upper extremity exercises. So the primary purpose was to investigate the inclusion of music with this idea that including music might help you practice more or practice differently. And I'll kind of put that to the side because, what we're focused on talking about today is this inclusion of people with aphasia. And so we were also motivated to have that be a big part of our study. So we intentionally included people with aphasia as the participants, and we made all of our materials to be aphasia friendly. So all the materials for the home program had some of these adaptations. So that meant that the instructions for the home program were made aphasia friendly. So we made instructions like how to do the exercises that were short, simple sentences. They had a series of pictures with the participant completing the exercise. So, for example, the different stages of petting your dog or brushing their dog. They had like a picture that showed each step of the process or the exercise. We used a large standard font and we had a lot of white space and other images to support some of the written words. Um, we also created a logbook for the person to record their practice and made that aphasia friendly so they could easily document the time they spent exercising. We did a few other things, like including a scale where the person could reflect on their practice. So, how much are you practicing? What's the quality of your practice? And they could answer or circle numbers on a scale from 1 to 5 to reflect their perception.
I'm just gonna jump in a sec.
Yeah.
I really like, first of all, in the article, there are some images. So if people are more like visual learners, it's like,
Yeah.
oh, you included those in the article. So people can check that out. But I really like too that you even thought to the level of the logbook, because we all know once we're working with clients, it's not enough to just tell them what to do, but like we really have to think through those methods of like how they're keeping track of actually completing it. So I thought that was a really cool detail and something that SLPs could kind of think about also.
Yeah, 100%. And that is definitely something I learned a lot from my OT colleagues are asking people to track their practice. And also this reflection on the practice for me, and we haven't investigated this in a research or rigorous research way, but I think having people do some reflection on how their practice went is another really nice way to encourage them and to get feedback as a clinician about what's working and what's not working for them.
Absolutely. I love that.
So, and then after the study, we did some interviews with the participants, which is another thing that I like having the opportunity to do, get to talk with people about what their experience was. And as we asked them to reflect on these modifications, and you know, it was a great opportunity to learn a lot from them. On the positive side, they said the instructions were really helpful and they liked having the writing and the images. They also really thought the information with reminders helped to clarify what was being asked of them. Um, they did report sometimes that recording the amount of time could be difficult for them. Um, and a thing that continued to come up both in this study and some other work I've done related to aphasia friendly modifications is that people get a little frustrated by the number of papers that are required or the number of pages, because when you start to add extra white space and you make the font large and you add a lot of images, it unfortunately means that there's a lot of papers. And so, we can create digital versions of that. There's still some complications, but that's really helpful feedback for us to receive as a team.
Yeah. So they like the methods that were used, but the bummer side effect is that
Yeah,
there might be more pages in their kind of homework packet. And
exactly.
that just leads to more to manage.
Yes, exactly. They
Okay.
kind of would gesture for us, like flipping through all these papers and how that's kind of annoying,
Yes.
which I understand.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. And they also talked a lot about the benefit of the step-by-step images for the exercises and how it helped that those were pictures of them completing the exercise, which helped them really personalize the instructions. They also indicated, though, that they would have liked more demonstrations in person, or maybe even that a video recording of a demonstration would be really helpful. So, again, great feedback.
Yeah.
Good opportunity to talk with people. Um, and then just a couple other things to kind of quickly mention that are a little tangential, but also have to do with this idea of aphasia-friendly modifications and including people with aphasia. We, in both clinical services and research, we also have talked in our second paper a little bit more about the aphasia-friendly modifications that we made to the assessment tools that the occupational therapist often uses. So this is another really great space where OTs and SLPs can collaborate in helping to make some of those tools something that people with aphasia can provide information on. So where they can provide some additional information to kind of, or where SLPs can be sure that the person with aphasia can provide a lot more information to help the OTs make some clinical decisions. And then just one other quick note, and again, tangential from what we're talking about today, I did have another student who looked at how we might modify medication instructions, which is different than home programs, but it's something that can be really important in terms of receiving good information, and accurate information. And we found some of the same results. People with aphasia like the larger fonts and the visuals, and they still were black and white images, and they didn't prefer those black and white images. So good takeaways from that as well.
They liked more of the color images over black and white.
Yeah.
My mind is just like spinning back to all the different medical settings that I've worked in. And I'm just like, one of my most meaningful times working as an SLP was when I first started going to clients' homes immediately after they discharged from inpatient rehab. And I had worked in inpatient rehab before then, but I never really understood what it was like right when people got home. And so once I started being the SLP there, one of the things I never realized was just that stack of papers that they get with the medicine, the recommendations, the follow-up appointments. And just in my mind, I'm seeing how not aphasia friendly those type of papers are. So cool. I love the research that you've done. I love that you're like kind of helping us think about how this might work with our colleagues in different, the OT, PT, nursing. We have lots of opportunities here. So I wonder if we could just talk about translating this into clinic then. So that's kind of my segue, as my mind immediately is thinking about the clinical settings I've worked in. My first wondering is, do we need to make different aphasia-friendly considerations for the severity or subtype of aphasia in different clients? Do we have any information on that?
Yeah, it's a really great question and a research question that I'd love to dig more into. So far, this hasn't been studied real rigorously or across big groups of people. Um, but I do think, we tend to make some judgments like people who have more severe reading impairments might need more modifications and things like that. And I don't think those instincts are wrong. But I kind of use two main guiding principles, or what I talk with students about in terms of what we know so far. Talking with people with aphasia about what they need and want. So I know time is really precious in a clinical setting, but looking at examples of modifications and what might be most helpful for them. And then also testing out those modifications to see what might work best. Because even a person with aphasia might be a little bit surprised. We have a participant who's not participated in some of our studies, and he'll tell me that he can't read, and he doesn't score really high on a lot of our traditional reading assessments. However, when I provide some written content next to an image, his comprehension of the image and the text improves. And so he gets to see that if I spend the time to test out some of these modifications. Something else we've learned a little bit across some of our other work that we've done related to reading is that it's really important to consider how modifications might change based on the type of materials you're reading. And what people's preferences are might also change. So, for example, reading a recipe is really different from reading a scientific article. That's really different from reading something on a post on social media, or even reading medication instructions. So, I think that's an important consideration and something as we're talking with our clients with aphasia to talk with them more about.
Right. Just understanding, yes, just even when we say reading, that's not one context. There's so many contexts, and we
Yes.
as SLPs can get preferences from our clients and make different adjustments for the different contexts.
Yeah,
Yep.
exactly. Even what you mentioned, all these written materials that people get sent home from the hospital with, even those materials might require different types of modifications depending on the type of information and the length of the information,
Yeah.
the complexity of it, and things like that.
So, one of your suggestions that you said you talked to students about was just maybe doing some trialing and like, hey, what's seeming better to you? So, do you see that as like something the SLP could maybe have your little folder of like, okay, we have three versions of checkoff logs for your home program, and one is like short sentences, and one is just like squares, and one is like a picture scale, or like you could almost take a little bit of time and develop
Yeah.
something and then offer it. I don't know, I'm just brainstorming here.
Yeah, 100%. And a really good example of that we didn't quite personalize, but in one of our studies, we gave people digital watches. And so they could write down the start time and stop time of their practice. And so for that, you'd have to be able to copy a digital number onto a sheet. So for some people, that was a relative strength and an easy-ish task to do. some of our in some of our other studies, we made like little boxes and had people mark off each time they practiced for 10 minutes. And that involves some different skills, right? Being able to read the 10, being able to do a little bit of math to know how many tens you should mark off. And each time we practiced those tracking strategies with people, and I can imagine in a clinical setting, just like you said, having maybe both available and doing some problem solving about what works best for you.
Yeah. Oh, cool. I love that. Um, so, okay, in the clinical process, where we're kind of getting into this already, but just thinking as SLPs that we are the ones to notice, like, oh, this type of modification might be helpful,
Mhm.
as like an aphasia friendly modification. And I don't know that we've always been discovered or like oriented to discover these or like talk about these or document about these. But I think as I've gotten more and more into the life participation approach, that's just part of, even from the assessment, the types of things I'm trying to notice. So what can you give us some examples of what those modifications are?
Yeah, absolutely. And this, Sarah, I appreciate it because this question gives me kind of an opportunity to kind of categorize some of my own thinking on this topic. And so, again, this research in some ways is very early, but in general, with some of the work that we've done, I think there's some areas of modifications that makes sense to consider when thinking about home programs. So these are in no particular order, too. I'll just tell you kind of some of the ones I would kind of
Yeah.
categorize. So the first would be any modifications for instructions related to the technology or the equipment that the person needs to use. So for us, with some of the tablet-based practices we've sent people home with, we provide photo-based instructions that, depending on the person's familiarity with technology, we may have some photos that show you where to plug in the charger on the tablet, to how to access the app on the tablet, how to turn the volume up and down. So some of the kind of foundational functions of a tablet, or maybe some of the higher level skills. And I think this can apply to other disciplines too. So equipment that they might be using for their exercises, how do you sort of do the setup, or what instructions are needed? Because again, when we send someone home, we want them to be able to do this practice independently, or as independent as possible.
Yes.
The next is another kind of instruction. So these instructions I think about as the like related specifically to the practice we want to have them do. So this is how to do the exercise, when to do the exercise, and how much of it to be practicing. So that could include a number of repetitions to do of the exercise, or a length of time. We want you to practice doing some reading for 5 minutes at a time. And we can give instructions to the person about when to practice. So in a lot of our studies, we don't dictate when they practice, but we have some instructions that show that we're trying not to dictate when you practice. We go through with them and say, you can practice in the morning, you can practice in the afternoon. You can split your practice up into the morning and afternoon or evening. And so those kinds of instructions, it helps for people to have reminders of those. It provides a lot of clarity around how you want them to practice, which I think is also really helpful, and people have told us is really helpful. The next one is aphasia-friendly modifications for how the person might track practice. So we've already talked about a few of these examples, but whether that's some type of log book, some way of recording the practice that they've done. And then also, as I kind of mentioned before, I sort of put in the same category, reflecting on the experience of practicing. So that can even just be like, how was practice today, good or bad? Was it hard for me to motivate today? Yes or no? We've done a couple of things where we've looked at some self-efficacy about practice, and those kinds of questions. But those can be as simple or as complex as what makes sense.
Okay.
But the person will need likely some modifications to be able to track their own practice. And then anything else that would help the person be more independent with their home practice activities. So for us, that means typically having some aphasia-friendly instructions about how to get a hold of us if you have questions. What to do if you're not sure about what to do with your exercise. So I think those things can also be really valuable. Maybe there's a resource that the person can go to if they have questions or something like that.
Awesome. I love to hear it kind of laid out like bullet points there. That's super clear. And I like the way that you're kind of viewing your home program and looking at all those different aspects of it and ways that we can support the person with aphasia. So just to talk specifically about home programs, I know for myself, giving home programs as an SLP in the beginning of my career, I really was spending a lot of time choosing those worksheets and being at the printer, and they were really out of context. Things like, writing words that started with a B, or matching opposites, or unscrambling letters. Like those were all examples of things that kind of more traditionally were a part of like a medical home program. So doing that type of copying worksheets didn't really allow me to adjust things to be aphasia friendly per se. I wasn't like making different choices for different people with different strengths and weaknesses, or being person centered. So I thought we might just talk about like what an aphasia friendly home program, just getting some examples of what it might look like, and just start to think about like maybe problem solve like how this might look in the real world, medical SLPs, the productivity issues and all that. So yeah, I know I'm giving you just this like messy problem and like,
Right.
what do you
Just
want to do with this, Sarah?
and I do think, I mean, I feel like this podcast is just me celebrating OTs, but I do think there's such a great opportunity to learn from them. So the life participation approach to aphasia is so intertwined with what a lot of occupational therapists have already been thinking a lot of.
Yeah.
And certainly there are other disciplines that we can learn from, and there's great opportunities for collaboration. But I'll share some of the things that I learned from my OT colleagues, because I think that for me has kind of inspired me to think not just about home programs differently, but also even the therapy that I do in person with somebody. It's really made me think about what it means to make something relevant to someone's participation. So, initially we always start out with some interviews, talking with people about activities they enjoy, something that they want to get back to doing, or something that they want to do better, or is there some type of frustration in their life? And I'm going to talk about this example a little bit in a moment, but when I think of this frustration in their life, this took us a while in an interview with one of the guys with aphasia that we worked with, but he talked about how he would ride passenger seat in the car and his right hemiparesis made it really hard for him to reach out and grab the mail from the mailbox when his wife would drive up to their mailbox. And so he would take his left hand and reach across his body, and how that was just a constant reminder to him of the effects of the stroke. And so, did he come to us and say, "Oh, I just love getting the mail"? It wasn't this activity that he was so motivated, but it was a frustration that was a daily, almost daily reminder for him about something that was a lot harder than it was before. And in many ways, then kind of a shift in identity from someone who could easily grab the mail before to somebody who grabbing the mail became a chore and a hassle. It's through these interviews that I really learned about talking with people about different types of activities that could be meaningful to them. A lot of people might use like a card sort to do these, to sort of identify those there's several tools available that you can use, card sort activities, following up with people in interviews. But some of the activities that we had people working on in some of our home programs, including something I mentioned before, the person wanted to work on brushing his dog, um, tying trash bags to help out with a household chore. Again, I don't know that anyone comes to you, probably not in your practice, and that Sarah is like, oh my goodness, I love taking the trash out. But it was
Nope.
a big shift. Right. Yeah. I can't imagine that anyone's like really missing that. But I think for him, and I think probably for a lot of people, that was a big part of his identity, was the trash is my job, or I'm part of the responsibility of taking the trash out. And so and I remember his wife kind of being surprised when he talked about wanting to be able to tie the trash bags together so that he could be part of that household chore. It was really important to him.
Yeah, I've kind of come to understand something I had to get over in my mind is when little things like that pop up, that I finally realized one day, like things don't have to take like tons of time in the day to
Yeah,
matter significantly to people. And I
for
think like
sure.
maybe early on I was like, well, that's just like a 2-minute job, when I remember someone who like just was frustrated with like getting like a stamp from her nursing home to send a letter. Like it's like, well, this is like a 1-minute interaction. Am I spending therapy working on this? But it's like, yeah, like the parts of our day that give us identity and meaning, it doesn't always mean it's like 8 hours of the day.
Right.
And it's worthwhile to address that.
Yeah, absolutely. And very similarly, I'm sure if you said to that person, what are some of your favorite things to do? she wouldn't say getting stamps,
Yeah, right.
right? But she
Exactly.
might instead say, like, staying in touch with friends, and then you need to dig deeper to find out how do you get to that.
Right.
Which I think
Or
is real.
even going with like what's bugging you right now? Like what's frustrating? Like
Yeah.
that is a good way to find that out. Mhm.
Yeah, no, absolutely. A couple other things someone wanted to work on staining tables. And these tasks too have a degree of like um the amount of physical movement that would be required. So they were a good match for the person's skills as well. Tightening screws in a piece of wood and writing um your name. There was someone who wanted to be able to sign their name on document and wanted to feel good about how their name looked. Because you could do just a little scribble and most people would say that's fine, but it was really important to her that her name looked how she wanted it to.
Those are
Um,
great.
yeah, it really did. Kind of like you were saying, the starts to have help me have these shifts in my practice of thinking about what's meaningful and then tying those into things that people can work on at home.
Yeah. So I love how much, you've talked a lot about partnering with other colleagues and specifically with OT. And I'm wondering if we have SLPs listening who are like thinking like, oh, this is such a great idea. There's potential here. And how would you recommend maybe an SLP who's never thought of that before? Do you have words of wisdom on how they might start that process on the interdisciplinary teams they're on in the various clinical settings that we work in?
Yeah, I think in my experience, some of the OTs and PTs, or even other professionals, may feel a little bit at a loss for how to work with some people with aphasia, especially some people with more severe aphasia. I think they may feel some of that struggle or may feel that desire to try to find ways to include people or to work with them in more similar ways. So hopefully it's that there's some interest on their end and that then, there's this great opportunity maybe to talk about it's a little different than sort of traditional co-treating, but maybe it's a good step in that direction to talk about, if you're going to be working with someone and sending the exercises to do at home as part of my therapy, can I work on them comprehending that home program, tracking that home program? Is that something, because that's part of participation too, is being able to participate in a rehabilitation program. So is that an opportunity I could help you designing that or send some of the materials home or something like that? I think that can be a real win-win across the
Yeah.
board. So I think that's how I might begin to approach that. Again, I was really fortunate that this was an opportunity that we were both looking for,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
yeah,
I love that. I think just starting with a conversation, anytime it would make sense, to look at, does co-treating work in the setting someone's in? Can you kind of use therapy time to explore and like collaborate a little bit? And otherwise, maybe just starting to do like lunches together and brainstorming, like how could we make this process efficient? As we know, we have multiple patients with aphasia going down the pipe. I think that's really interesting. So, okay. So I am going to go to talking maximum impact. Can you give us 3 actionable takeaways that you would love for clinicians to put into practice?
yeah, absolutely. So I think first and foremost is using the opportunity to collaborate with the people with aphasia that you work with to determine which modifications work for them. And remember, we're not always right, and it's okay to try something out and be wrong and try something different. So I think kind of being flexible. In addition to personalizing, I think there's also a great opportunity to create generic aphasia-friendly materials wherever you might work with individuals with aphasia. So thinking about documents that could be made aphasia friendly, like maybe the intake form that you use, or maybe you start with something even smaller, like a sign in the waiting room, and just start to make some of those little changes. I think can have big impact or can work towards big impact. And then, it's kind of a theme throughout, but this idea of finding ways to collaborate with other professionals so that you can have some aphasia-friendly modifications that can support people with aphasia in home programs, but maybe across rehabilitation in general.
I love that. And I love that you're making it easy. We can just start with one thing and go from there. You don't have to overhaul everything at one time. But that's great advice. Can we help the audience apply it by talking through a hypothetical and applicable case example?
Yeah, sure. And I have trouble not talking about this. I've already told you a little bit about the person that I'm going to talk a little bit about. And this person, we'll call him Don. And he had a stroke and was diagnosed with aphasia about a decade before I first met him. And he was about 75 years old when I met him, with his wife and their adult children, had moved out but lived locally. He had a couple of grandchildren who he loved to talk about. And he had previously worked as a salesman for a local medical supply company. And his wife, Shelley, had also recently retired, was really active in the community, and had previously been a school librarian. So he was diagnosed with aphasia and had right hemiparesis. And when he was in the hospital, he had received therapy across the board, and was really happy, by the way, with the services that he'd been provided and would often tell me how great they were. But I think did, as many people with aphasia do, became frustrated that a decade out of beyond his stroke, he felt like he still had a lot of potential to make progress and there were still things he wanted to do, but he was no longer receiving those services. His gains weren't robust enough to continue to be funded through insurance. He did what I think a lot of people do if it's accessible to them, is he sought out research studies at universities to try to kind of get any types of services. Again, PT, OT, speech. So he was, again, this is pretty typical to a lot of the people that I end up meeting, where he was looking for more opportunities, but wasn't kind of getting those direct services. So my OT colleague and I had the opportunity to work with Don and specifically to address some of the limitations related to his right hemiparesis that he experienced in both his right hand and arm. I told you a little bit about how we would work together for the occupational therapy assessment to modify those and to talk with him specifically about things that were difficult for him, and then kind of using a standardized assessment sort of as a base. We would then kind of follow up with interview questions and learn more about what he was interested in. And I've mentioned a lot of these tests already, but he was interested in being able to return to brushing his dog, named Luna, and getting the mail out of the mailbox. And, I talked a little bit about each of those tasks, but in part, I think some of what we know about home practice is making it really relevant to the person. And these were, as I kind of mentioned, are tasks that were really important to him. They also met some other goals in terms of meeting his level of function. And so those were really important for him. For these, we created some aphasia-friendly materials. The instructions were pretty low level. These are not high-tech home program exercises, but we still provided instructions about tracking and how often he was meant to practice. And we made a lot of the modifications that we've talked about here. In some studies, we've used timers to have people track when or how long they've been practicing. He was someone who used a digital watch and recorded his practice. So, this was an example of someone who was really able to use some modifications that we presented to him, and was able to be pretty successful in tracking his practice. Our studies aren't always about whether or not people get better with the movement, but we're really interested in do they participate in the practice? And so he was really successful in participating in the practice that we provided to him. I want to shift a little bit and talk about some people I wouldn't say weren't successful, but did struggle a little bit more. And I think this was a nice lesson for me because things had gone so relatively well with Dawn that when we worked with some other participants, they had a lot more difficulty counting the repetitions of their exercise. And so, he was counting the number of brushes of his dog, and that was something that he could do given his language abilities. But we worked with some other participants who had a lot harder time counting the repetitions. And at the end of the day, if someone practices something 8 times versus 11, it's not a huge concern, but it was concerning for them. And so my OT colleague had some great ideas for this. So for one of them, we had a person who was interested in doing some like repair, light household work. And so he practiced putting screws into a block of wood, and the block of wood had already had specific locations, and there were 10 of them, and he was supposed to do 10 repetitions. So this was a great task that didn't involve a lot of counting. And this, I think, is such a good example. This OT had, at this point, been working together for a while, and so we can kind of brainstorm what can work so they don't have to count. But we did a similar one with the person who wanted to practice working on writing her name. We gave her a number of blank slots. We had her write her name 20 times. And so we had 20 slots, and she would write her name, and then that was all of her practice for the day. So hopefully that gives some examples. I think with Dawn of like when things went really well without adjustments on our end, and then some examples of us needing to make some changes.
That's great to include because, that's happening to us all the time, in clinical settings. It's like, this is working. Oh, this is not working for the same person. So it's good to hear, even in research, you're noticing and adjusting for different people. Thank you so much for being here, Sarah. To wrap things up today, what final words of wisdom or inspiration would you like to leave with the audience?
Yeah, I think really a takeaway for me is looking for inspiration outside of ourselves. And so that can include listening to our colleagues, like my occupational therapist colleagues, and also listening to folks with aphasia, that there's so much to learn from them. Just kind of taking their perspective can really infuse and kind of re-energize your practice, I think.
That is wonderful. I have to say, you're carrying the torch. I appreciate the mentorship that we've all had, and I appreciate you too. So thank you for carrying the torch and passing it on along to us. We appreciate your clinical insights. We look forward to the adjustments we can make so that our home programs are aphasia friendly. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. I appreciate it.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Speech Scope by MedBridge. Please be sure to subscribe and listen to more of our episodes on Spotify or on your favorite podcast platform and at medbridge.com. If you're listening outside of the MedBridge catalog and would like to access the bonus resources and receive continuing education credit, simply log into your MedBridge account and search for this episode to find the accreditation details. Speech Scope also listens to you. If there's a particular clinician that you'd like to hear from, or if you have a clinical question or challenge that you'd like to see addressed on this podcast, please let us know by leaving a comment on our Instagram posts or by emailing podcasts@medbridge.com.